so that if you type in or the dog's barking or anything, it doesn't disturb our speaker so much. I think I might kick off by introducing our first speaker. Our first speaker is actually Thomas Schaff. So I need to refer to my notes here for everybody. So, because I can't actually say the word gerontology without looking at it. So Thomas Schaff is a professor of social gerontology at Newcastle University, and he co-leads the university's Centre for Ageing and Inequalities. I first came across Thomas prolifically tweeting using the No More Wrinkly Hands hashtag. So I think we've got a lot in common on this subject. So Tom's research addresses issues related to social exclusion in later life, often focusing on the spaces and places in which exclusion arrives. But I've also seen him challenging the way that older people are represented in the media on a really regular basis. So thank you very much. We'd like to kick off, Thomas.
Well, thanks very much. Now, just while I share my screen. So there we go. So thank you for the invitation to share some of my thoughts on the ways in which older people are represented in the media. And I feel I need to start with apology for some of the images that I'm about to show, that these are pretty distasteful and wouldn't win any prizes in a competition unless it's for the worst possible images of aging. And one of the things, though, is before COVID-19, images of aging didn't really feature very heavily in my work, but anyone who follows me on Twitter will know that I've developed something of an acute interest in the stereotypical and often ageist ways in which older people are represented over the course of the pandemic. But most of my work really relates to social exclusion in later life, and most of the topics that I have an interest in fit somewhere in this model of social exclusion. And where the media representation of aging fits in for me is in this idea of sociocultural exclusion, symbolic exclusion, ageism, age discrimination, serve to other older people, separating them from mainstream of society. But what's important and something to bear in mind is the way that this type of exclusion can intersect with other forms of disadvantage that affect people in later life. For example, poverty, loneliness, lack of opportunities for civic participation. So for me, that's the broader context for focus on the media representations of aging and later life. But when we talk about ageism, I'm just thinking, well, you know, what do we mean by ageism? And this is a topic which has concerned social gerontologists for many years, going back to Robert Butler's term definition of ageism in the sort of late 1960s, where he described ageism as being the prejudice of one group against another group. Now, 50 years on, there's still a lively debate about what our understanding of ageism might be. And in their recent book, Liat Ayalon and Clemens Tesch-Römer define ageism as being the complex, often negative construction of old age, which takes place at the individual and the societal levels. And ageism really remains one of the main forms of discrimination that is widely tolerated in society. While researchers sometimes describe different forms of ageism, I like to draw on some of the historical work of Julia Johnson and Bill Bytheway, who identify three broad forms of ageism, and I'll bring in another in a moment. They refer to institutionalized ageism, including legislative discrimination against people over and below particular ages, an internalized form of ageism that relates to negative and derogatory references to older people, and a very pervasive form of ageism referred to as benevolent patronage that involves assumptions that older people are incapable of independent decision making, that they need special protections and safeguards. Now, over the course of the pandemic, there are clear examples of each of these forms of ageism. I would see institutionalized ageism represented in the absence of a gerontologist or geriatrician on the scientific advisory group for emergencies, for example. It's also there in the mooted restrictions based solely on the application of chronological age that reinforce negative stereotypes of old age. We see examples of internalized ageism, where older people are stopped in the streets and people are suggesting that they should really go back home and keep safe indoors, or that older people shouldn't be out picking up their prescriptions or doing their own shopping. That these are often sort of represented in quite negative comments made directly to older people in public environments, where older people's lives are viewed as being less valued than the lives of other people. And benevolent ageism exists in a focus on older people's apparent vulnerability to loneliness or their supposed inability to use digital technologies. But what today's webinar focuses on for me is a somewhat different version of ageism that really reflects our digitalized and mediatized society. And this is where I think it's useful to draw on the work of Lois and Ivan, who describe visual ageism as being the social practice of visually underrepresenting older people or misrepresenting them in a prejudiced way. And that's really got me thinking about, one of my concerns about how older people are being represented, especially over the course of COVID. So here we go with some of the images. Right, that recent work by Hannah Swift and Ben Steeden for the Centre for Ageing Better reminds us of how media organizations shape and perpetuate negative attitudes and stereotypes of aging. And we see this in countless examples of how older people have been represented as being vulnerable. In particular, we see this in use of stock images that dehumanize people and reduce them to a series of body parts. The images are used by a wide range of media organizations who really should know better. Images of wrinkly hands with or without walking sticks have been deployed by media organizations to depict all manner of stories that are associated in some way with age and aging. But I think what they have in common is the prejudicial misrepresentation of later life. No one is immune from this type of misrepresentation, not think tanks, not policy advocates, not even researchers in social gerontology whose work can be misrepresented in multiple ways. So this is an image that was used by the EU Observer to illustrate a story written by colleagues from Age Platform Europe about the risks of elder abuse during COVID-19. And in their calling for greater age equality, Estelle Houchet and Boya Aru Astrain argue that elder abuse is the most harmful expression of ageism, and we won't address it unless we look into the institutionalized stereotypes, prejudices, and discrimination that we hold against people because of their age. And this is why this is such a great image. How can you have this image alongside a story that's calling for greater age equality? These are the sort of images that people around the world now like to share with me through Twitter. I have the worst Twitter feed in the world, I think. I don't know why and how this has happened, but it seems to have happened. But what these stock images emphasize is a deficit model of aging that links later life with frailty, vulnerability, dependency, ill health, cognitive decline, lack of capability, all sorts of negative terminology is reflected in these images that are entirely pervasive. And when not focusing on wrinkly hands, we also see the dehumanized body parts taken out of context, often by large media concerns, the BBC, ITV, The Guardian, The Telegraph, you name them, they're using these same images. And, you know, some organizations, you know, can't really help themselves from, you know, this image in the bottom sort of right-hand corner there of people almost sitting, waiting for death to happen. These are just awful images. There's a particular place in my heart, given my long-standing interest in poverty, for images relating to the finances of later life. Right, some media organizations use images of piggy banks or glass jars with a label pensions across them to point to older people's material resources. Other organizations find that pretty sophisticated, and they just revert to these types of images of wrinkly hands with a jumble of coins in them that focus on, in some cases, the left-hand picture's been used to talk about how older people are going to lift the UK out of the recession that's arisen because of COVID. Right, good luck is all I can say. If that's the future of our economy, we're not going to get out of COVID with those few coins. So how do these images really sit with the equally current focus on the longevity economy and what we know about the considerable purchasing power of older consumers? So I'd like to really conclude this short presentation with some thoughts about how we might best respond to the challenges of what we can regard as visual ageism. I think COVID-19's exposed the deep-seated ageism that exists in society. This has contributed, in my view, to the excessive number of deaths of older people during the course of the pandemic. So there's a considerable urgency in challenging ageism in its different forms. And we all have our own part to play in that. So we can all call to account media organizations that misrepresent aging in later life in prejudicial ways. Sometimes a direct challenge can lead an organization to switch an image to something that's less offensive and more reflective of a diverse older population. And I think we really should be celebrating even these small victories, because it shows what can be done if we act to counteract ageism. Demonizing the media has its limits, and it also undermines the excellent work that's often done in relation to questions around aging and later life. So I'd favor a more collaborative approach that engages media organizations in changing the way in which they represent aging. This requires discussion, awareness raising of what is wrong with many of the existing images that are used to illustrate stories. But equally important is the need to reconfigure the demand and supply of images of aging in later life. If media organizations request different images that better reflect the diversity of later life, then we also need to fill the digital image banks with better images. This is where photo competitions like the Manchester competition really have a role to play. But we also need to work with photographers and other digital content producers to curb the supply of prejudicial images. And finally, I think we should focus attention on developing guidelines on non-stigmatizing use of visual images. A useful guide produced recently by the Cochrane Library represents a step in this direction, but we can also go further in articulating some of the do's and don'ts of visual images of aging. So thanks very much for listening. I'm looking forward to discussion. Especially looking forward to seeing some of Alex's more uplifting images of older people that challenge some of the stereotypes that I've been presenting in my work. So thanks very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was really, that was a brilliant way to start ourselves off this morning. I really enjoyed your description of visual ageism and how that cuts across cultural ageism, identity exclusion, inhibiting civic participation, and how this all contributes to the deficit model of aging. And also it was great at the end to see some actions that we can maybe think about how we can contribute to. So collaborative working with media organisations, contributing to developing guidelines of non-stigmatising use of visual images. Those are things that I think we could probably talk about in the future about how we can do that. And hopefully our photography competition will contribute to that. Please, if you have any questions for Tom or any of the other presenters, please put them in the chat, and myself and Liz, will take some of those questions and present them when all three speakers have finished. So for now, I'd like to move on to introduce Alex. Alex Rotas is a photographer who specialises was a sports photographer and has latterly specialised in photographing older people. She's an award-winning photographer and has held exhibitions in the UK, across Europe, and in the US. You've worked with Alex with the World Health Organization on an exhibition around the decade of healthy aging, which is going to be launching, I think it's launching this year at some point. And also you're currently making a documentary, which I'm really looking forward to seeing, called The Maverick Generation, about older female athletes. You're an activist and really challenging the way people represent older people in the media through your work. So Alex, thank you very much for joining us from Greece. I'm not going to mention that again, because I'm just going to make myself even more jealous.
Thank you, thank you. Thanks so much, Julie. Well, I'm just going to now share my screen. And sorry. Whoops. Sorry, I want to get to the first one. Sorry about that. Not trying to fit in with the stereotype of older people not being very technologically brilliant. So here we go. I'm going to time myself for 10 minutes, just in a minute. I'm going to do a whistle stop tour. I'm putting my timer on. So I want to take you through some of the images that I take. They are in contrast to the images that Tom shared with us. And it's not very hard to find joyful, positive images when you do what I do, which is go around the world and photograph athletes, masters athletes. I specialize in athletes in their 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and 100s who are still competing on the world stage. The joy just shines out and you get a totally different sense of aging because people are in a community with other people that share their interests and they're doing what they love doing. The athleticism of these people is quite something, and I think challenges this notion of the frail elderly, the frail and vulnerable, those of us, myself included, who are over 70. This is Angela Copson. She's world champion in the women's 10,000 meters. Here she is creating a new world record. And you can see the joy in her face as she crosses the finishing line. But I want to draw your attention to the fact that I think she looks wonderful. And she doesn't necessarily look younger than she is. I mean, look at the muscularity, look at her physique. She's in her prime. But you can also see the wrinkles, the crepey skin that all of us have when we as we age. And I think she looks wonderful. The point is, my central thesis, I guess, is that you don't have to look younger than you are to look wonderful. This is Ian Richards, also creating a new world record. He's a race walker, crossing the finishing line last year in Poland. And all his training, everything came together. It worked. He crossed the finishing line. He got a gold medal and he made a new world record. And it shows. And he is also part of the frail and vulnerable over 70s. Yes, he's 70. One of the things I wanted to emphasize in my pictures is the opposite of the dependency sort of stereotype that Tom was drawing our attention to. So these people have agency. They are not slumped. They are doing stuff. They are determined, disciplined, focused. This is Irina Behrer, great American athlete. She holds the world record for the women's 100 meters. For those of you who are interested, the world record stands at 16.8 seconds. Just think Usain Bolt, 10 seconds, just off. So this is a woman in her 80s running 100 meters in 16.8 seconds. And doesn't she look great? Again, I think she looks old. She looks fabulous. She's in her prime. Similarly, Earl Fee, great Canadian athlete in the middle distance. I took this photo when he was just a month or so shy of his 90th birthday. Look at the upright posture, look at the focus, the determination, the sense of agency, the muscularity. He's an old man. You're not going to say he looks young, he looks old, and he looks fabulous. Just so you get some idea of how I think we underestimate what the aging human body is capable of, these athletes really show what can be done. This is world champion Brazilian athlete. He's 90 and he is competing here in the long jump. He didn't get a world record. He was 1 centimeter off it, but he got the gold medal. But look at the height that he is above the ground. He has raced in that run up to this jump. He has leapt into the air. He's going to fall into the sand, onto his wrists, and he's not going to break them. Terrific. If I asked you to imagine what a woman in her mid-70s looks like doing the high jump, I don't know if this is the sort of image that would instantly pop into your head, but this indeed is a woman in her mid-70s doing the high jump. This is Sue Yeomans, wonderful, wonderful British athlete, wonderful human being, world champion pole vaulter, age 66 or 67 in this image. Look at the muscularity, look at her arms, look at her legs, look at the six-pack, incredible. And Sue, like so many of these athletes, she's had the same sort of health issues that hit lots of older people. She's had a couple of cancers. She's happy for me to share this information, but she, like all these athletes, she deals with her illness, her cancer or whatever, and then she's back there doing the sport she loves. And the fact she's got a passion, I think, helps her through the illnesses. This is the only picture I'm going to show you that fetishizes youth. This is Rose Green, world champion in the 400 meters in the women's 80 to 84-year-old age group. She's 80. So she does look younger than she is. She looks incredible, but I can't resist sharing this with you. I want you to enjoy her muscularity, her athleticism, her bling, her nails, her nail varnish, her lipstick, and her joy, above all, her joy. Amazing. This picture isn't necessarily a great picture, but I'm sharing it with you because I want you to look at the stride. This is a woman in her 80s, Crystal Donnelly, an American athlete. She's in this picture, I think she's 82 or 83. Look at the stride, the width of her legs as she's running, both feet off the ground. I run, I don't look like that when I run. This is incredible, an incredible athleticism. As I say, we need to recalibrate, rethink what the aging human body is capable of. Another 80-year-old, Hildegard Berkel, just winning a 100-meter race. Excuse me. I like this picture because, again, you can see the muscularity, you can see how great she looks, but you can also see her age. She's got the wrinkles, she's got the crepey arms, she's got the hair flying backwards because she's going so fast. But you're not going to say this is a young woman. This is an old woman looking fab. This is a bit of fun. I wanted to show you a couple of pictures, this picture of these two athletes. On the left, Flo Myler, she's 84 in this picture. On the right, Krista Bortignon, Canadian athlete, 81 or 82. They are just off the blocks in an indoor competition in Poland last year. Off the blocks, my friends. Can you imagine women in their 80s crouched down on the blocks, the gun goes, they have to leap forward and race to the finishing line. I think we're used to seeing pictures of younger athletes. These are men in their 40s. This is the sort of stereotypical athletic picture. But to my mind, these two women in their 80s, they've got the same stance, the same arm movement, the incline, extraordinary. Tony Balman, wonderful British athlete. He's had his health issues. Again, he's happy for me to share them. He's had heart surgery, he's had bowel surgery, but he calls himself, he says, I think I'm the fittest 81-year-old in Great Britain. So he doesn't think about the things that have gone wrong with him. He thinks about his training, the fact that he does what he loves doing, which is athletics. He's a world champion hurdler and sprinter. He's also a tennis player, a ballroom dancer, and he plays in the England over 80 hockey team. I bet you didn't know that there was such a thing. If I said to you, imagine a man in his 80s doing the hurdles, I don't know if this is the sort of image that would come to mind, but this is Alan Carter, 80-year-old athlete winning the men's hurdle event in Spain a couple of years ago. And these are the pictures I'm going to end on. This was an Indian athlete, and I was kind of fascinated with him because he was competing in Poland, and I loved his serenity. He seemed to be competing with his eyes shut. So I was trying to capture something of the serenity that he seemed to embody. And somebody next to me said, well, you know who he is? Oh, he's competing, by the way, in the men's 80 to 84-year-olds. I think he was 82. So this somebody standing next to me said, well, you know who he is? His mum's here. And I said, what? I mean, imagine somebody in their 80s and their mum's there in the stands cheering them on. I mean, how wonderful is that? She wasn't in the stands. She was outside competing in the women's 100 to 104-year-old javelin event. This is Mankur, 103 years old, from India. And I think she shows us that at 103, you can still be joyful, be full of life, have agency, be raising maybe your wrinkly hands to the sky, but it's a very positive sort of image. And that's the one I'd like to end on. Gosh, and I haven't gone over my 10 minutes. I will stop my sharing.
Thank you so much, Alex.
And here I am back. And thank you so much.
You're getting a round of applause. I think that that's just made me really happy. I was feeling a bit cross after Tom, and not because of Tom, but all the stuff he was highlighting. And those images are just so joyous and wonderful. And you really have illustrated the opposite of dependency, which is agency. And obviously we can't all be national, international athletes, but we can all find some small way to have agency, and that looks very different to everyone. There's a comment that I just wanted to read before we move on from is Diana Lukic. Forgive me if I've got that wrong. I think we all have a problem when it comes to portraying poverty of older people, dependency and other difficult issues. It comes naturally that when we talk about positive sides of aging, we have a wider possibility of portraying active and healthy older people. So by broadening our understanding on how we represent older people, we broaden what we can show. There's much more possibility and range. Right, we're going to move on to our final speaker contributor in this this section, and that is Steve Connor. So Steve Connor is co-founder and CEO of Creative Concern. He's a strategist, writer and communications consultant, and specialises in ethical and sustainability issues. He's worked in integrated campaigns, city strategies, brand development, including developing the visual identity and brand for the new Creative Ageing Development Agency that has recently opened, funded by Bearings and hosted at Manchester Museum. So Steve, it would be brilliant to hear from you and your kind of more of an industry perspective on this. So thanks, Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Julie, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak. And I hope I won't make you cross again. I'm really conscious of that. We've gone to a happy place, and I've just got my notes in front of me. And I'm thinking, I'm going to make us unhappy. Anyway, I'll try not to. I'll end up on a very positive up note that meets my two other speakers. I'm also not going to use slides. partly because I knew that this would be a very visually sort of rich experience for everybody. So I thought I'd just talk through language more than visuals as a sort of counterpoint to Tom and Alex, really. So yes, we've just finished the brand for the new Creative Aging Development Agency with our colleague Virginia Tandy, based at the University of Manchester. And inevitably, the first conversation we had with Virginia was, how are we describing your cohort? Are we going to talk about elderly people, older people? And so I was really conscious of language use as we got into it. And the first time I ever got challenged about ageism in my practice, which is marketing, advertising, and the media, was actually many years ago, when the impresario Tony Wilson, using expletives that I won't share this morning, so I'll keep it clean, but challenged me because he said, why have you used that soundtrack for that film you're making? And I said, well, it's for an older audience. You've got to keep it, you know, tone it down a little bit. And he said, expletive. I've just seen a Saga Holidays ad with a house track behind it. Things have changed. Move on, young man. So I did. So he taught me a lesson there about language use and what we can expect about working with older people. Now, when it comes to language use, I've started looking into this since we worked on that latest project with CARDA. And first of all, the terms are really loaded. So I'm sure many of you will have encountered this, but elders, for example, you might turn to. We talked to CARDA when we were developing their brand about using the term elders, but immediately it sounds tribal and slightly odd, particularly to a UK audience. Senior citizen is incredibly loaded as a term, widely recognised, but people have massive problems with it. Elderly itself immediately commutes sort of frailty, putting people into a home. And older people is what most people turn to, but then that's really complicated because, as I've found out in working in this space, it covers an incredibly extreme age group from 50 to 100 or more, as Alex has just shown us with javelins. So it's really tricky. And certainly, if you're talking about aging for the younger end of that spectrum, for a generation who brought you drink, drugs, and rock and roll, they do not want to be pigeonholed in any way, particularly linguistically. And then also, when you start looking at some of the studies that have been done into language use, and in particular advertising, you find that there are phrases that keep reoccurring that are really problematic. Spry, sprightly, sweet little old lady. You want that a bit more? So there are actually words that reoccur far too much and are really problematic. And then that gets you into the thinking about whether, particularly in news reporting rather than advertising, which is my main area, do we need to even talk about age? There was the model Cindy Thompson described aging simply as living. Aging is living, nothing more. It's just a different word. So do we need to talk about age? And if you look at news reports, you'll find that age is referenced increasingly as you get older. So 76-year-old driver collided with pedestrians. There's no need actually in that story. And good practice in the media says you only refer to race, for example, if it's germane to the story. And so age doesn't really need to always be reported. And an extension of that, which a few people in studies have picked up on, which I find really interesting in language use, is the idea that there's surprise and wonder at people still doing the sort of stuff that Alex has just been showing us. And you'll find it. And I started to Google this over the last couple of days, Julie, after you suggested I might talk today. And you get these phrases where she's still working at 72. And even at 74, Fred remains a keen gardener, as if at 74, Fred should be just, farting quietly in the corner and not gardening. And Janice still enjoys a daily jog at 67. Well, why shouldn't she? And then the worst, of course, is the classic. Even in their 60s, they still enjoy a full and rewarding sex life. And so it's like, that whole idea that there should be wonder and surprise that people are still alive. So I think that's really tricky in language. And I think, I hope the counterpoint to Tom's thoughts about visual language. And then also there are a whole bunch of clangers and cliches that once you start to be conscious of this, they keep popping up. Autumn years, long in the tooth, ripe, waning. and a huge number of D words: dotage, declining, doddery, dowdy. And so I think there's a whole bunch of words that we should really challenge. And then also a funny sort of occurrence and piece of practice, which is using youth in an ironic way in describing older people. So he had a youthful countenance, or her voice retained its youth, or even saying hello young lady to somebody who's 20 or 30 years your senior in an excruciatingly patronizing way. And I think this extends then through to the other thing that I was thinking about in preparing for today, which was the sort of positive versus negative tropes that you see, and how we've picked up on it, but the whole idea of a burden of an aging society is really loaded as a phrase, and the idea of a demographic time bomb. I mean, how can that still be used and as it seek to depict positivity in older age? And then, as Tom's mentioned, Brexit hasn't helped. Sorry, COVID hasn't helped, because that has at times been positioned as a sort of young versus old. And then there's Brexit as well, where there has been a recasting of older people, perhaps as the enemy. Now, I think I'm guilty of this, thinking of sort of an Alf Garnett as a Dominic Cummings sock puppet, which I don't think the phrase has ever been used before. But the idea of sort of, you know, a sort of generational war doesn't help. And then the final thing before I wrap up with an idea for us to take forward is the invisibility of older people, particularly in my practice in advertising, beyond those sort of cliche stock images that Tom was showing us. Because what's really astounding once you start to look at the studies is that older people are totally invisible in advertising almost. One study showed that whilst in Saga magazine, as you'd expect, 62% of the images used were of older people. In BBC Good Food, that was less than 6% of the images. Marie Claire was 3%. Men's Health was less than 1% of the images they looked at. And then another survey that was done, a big one of 50,000 people, asked people over 50 whether they thought they were represented, and 89% of people said they just didn't recognize any images of themselves in the mainstream media. So actually there's a really extreme position here, which is actually older people become invisible in my industry. And it's actually accompanied by ageism within the industry itself. So in the media and creative sector, there's a really profound ageism. There's been studies that have shown that once you get 15, 20, 30 years in the sector, either you've ascended to a position of extreme leadership or you're seen as past it in some way. And so I think there is actually an ageism within the creative sector and within media. So just to wrap up, because I'm like Alex, I'm trying to stay on time. I thought I'd suggest a sort of code, perhaps, that we might meet Tom on in that sort of media collaboration that he was talking about. And I was thinking about what might actually work in our sector. And I was thinking about a charter where we might start by thinking about measurably and proactively increasing the positive visibility of older people would be a really good starting point. My second point would be counter the cliches and stereotypes that I've talked about today. That are woefully outdated and very visible once you spot them, so we can actually counter them. And then forensically tackle language which is loaded with very disempowering negatives and should be struck out. We've done the same thing, hopefully, in other spheres, and we can do it here. And then, as I said right at the start, if aging is another word for living, then actually we're tackling the story of life itself. And so we don't need to reference age, but just include older people in the marketing mix in a really organic and holistic way. Thanks, that's me done.
Thank you. So another round of applause. Thank you so much, Steve. That was really thought-provoking. I really enjoyed the way that you highlighted that we look in kind of wonder and surprise at people, and the way that visual ageism is linked very much, of course, to language, with expressions like people, even in their 60s, they are still doing this and they are still doing that. And I really liked your actions at the end. I'm a pragmatist, so talking the idea that we can work towards some kind of media charter, and we start countering cliches and stereotypes and forensically tackle language. I think that's a great call to action. I think we're probably going to have some interesting discussions after this about how we can do that. We haven't had many questions in the chat. but we have got a couple. So I'm just gonna throw those open to Alex, Tom and Steve, so whoever wants to answer. So there's a question here from Sophie Handler. So she says, I'm wondering if there are any lessons to be learned from the way in which the women's movement has sought and is still trying to challenge sexist imagery. Steve, you kind of alluded to other areas, other identities as well. So anybody want to respond to that? Any of the three of you? Go on then, Steve.
Yeah, I could go very briefly and then I won't hog it. But yes, when I was looking at this and looking at the idea of a code, it massively reminded me of challenging sexism in particular and gender stereotypes in the media. But then also when Tom was kicking off, his whole narrative around, sorry, not kicking off Tom in a sort of, I'm having a rant sort of way, but when he started us today, the images he used are so similar to some of us who've looked intensely at pornographic images and negative images of women and the sort of fragmenting of the female body. So it really did resonate for me. And even the studies that I looked at for ageism within my own sector also threw up a really sort of horrible Venn diagram of sexism and ageism overlapping each other in a really negative way. So I think it's a really good point that Sophie's pointed out.
Yeah, that idea of fragmenting the body, Tom, you talked about that as well. I think that's it's very common, isn't it?
It is, and I think it's done in other ways as well. So I think an intersectional approach is really helpful because we wouldn't be representing or other key societal groups in the way that older people are represented. But one of the other, that really I'm spoiled for choice today choosing images, but if you did it, just Googled a search for images around loneliness or mental ill health, it's exactly the same. So I think there's an issue here about the awful way in which media organizations just misrepresent key social groups, and older people aren't necessarily targeted for particular attention. I think it's the inattention, the lack of understanding, the I'd hate to think that this was really entirely deliberate, put it that way. I think there's an educational task which is why competitions like the Manchester competition are so helpful, and that we need a much more realistic view, and some sort of professional code is a really good idea. There is obviously the editor's code in the sort of print media, the journal that is used, but age isn't figuring very heavily within that code. So I think there is space for a broader societal campaign that really is clear about what the objectives of that are and doesn't separate us from media organizations. That media organizations reflect wider society and we need to work with them collaboratively. And I've been really encouraged when I've sort of just contacted some smaller organizations directly to point out that the images that they're using are inappropriate, that some have been quick off the mark to understand and say sorry and to change the image. It's the big organizations that appear incapable of doing that.
Can I just say something? I think you're absolutely right. And I never cease to be shocked at the fact that people haven't learned from the knowledge that if you represent women by a single body part, it's offensive. And yet we can represent a whole category of people, us older people, by a single body part. And that's somehow meant to be okay. Let's join up the dots. So good question, I think.
Well, linked to that, Andy Barry from the Royal Exchange asks, if a journalist writes an article about social care and the challenges in this sector, what images would the panel suggest they use? Tricky question.
Well, in some ways it's not a tricky question, because if you look at the image banks, there are decent images that illustrate people in care situations. You just have to find them. I think what happens is that there's some algorithm that ranks images, that the first ones you see at the top of the image bank are the wrinkly hands and the sticks and the body parts. But if you take a bit of time, which I know photo editors often don't have time at all, that they've got to make a decision within 10 to 20 seconds about what image they're going to use. But there must be a way of, like you can in Google, of raising, you know, better stock images up the ranking that they are then used. And you know, this is about an internalized form of ageism. It's about people not wanting to see old bodies, you know, in whatever state they're in. But you know, people living in care homes sometimes have bodies that you know, don't meet the norms of a youthful society. So, but I think the more we get to see real people's bodies, the better it is, the more accepting we're going to be of an aging society.
And if I could just add that there's, as you said, as you suggested, there are some wonderful images of care homes. My mother's in a care home, she's 99. And I think if I took my camera there, I could get the same sorts of joyful images that I've got of sports people from the care home. There's a tremendous amount of joy. And, you know, we just need to get away from the stock, as you suggest, sort of negative, slumped, passive, dependency sort of images.
Okay, related to that, there's a question from Manveen, and that's how to weigh the controversial successful aging model against pervasive ageism. So that's, how do we balance that, you know, these images of successful aging with pervasive aging? I don't know, I think that links with a question that we had kind of in our back pockets, which is, do good images of old people need to be positive images?
Can I come in there? Because I quite often get, I don't know about whether the word would be criticized, but the notion that I'm presenting the one way that you can successfully age is one that I'd really like to counter. I've just chosen to take photographs of older athletes because I'm interested, I'm sporty, I'm interested in sport. And I do think we need to raise the bar in challenging how we view the possibilities of the aging human body. But of course, successful aging can happen in so many different ways, and you can successfully and actively age in a chair. I mean, if you stay mentally alert, you do the best with whatever you've got. None of us know how we're going to end up. And there are so many ways to successfully age, and I think it is a concept that we need to challenge and question, and I'm really glad that it's been brought up now. And certainly I'm not, you know, my suggestion, I'm not trying to suggest that everyone should become an athlete. That would be absolutely absurd. It's just what I've chosen to document.
One of the things that I thought about, but we obviously in 10 minutes you don't have a lot of time, was that I would have liked to have had a slide on baby boomers and successful ages that also come from some of the image banks, because these are just as awful as the wrinkly hands photos, but that would be another presentation altogether. And one of the challenges we have is that, you know, many of the image banks are using US-based imagery that is culturally inappropriate in the United Kingdom. So, you know, grey-haired couples in linen suits on yachts, or you know, people sitting in front of their MacBooks looking at their shares going up. You know, these, we all know these, and there's another story to be told about those. But so I think the argument really is for a diversity, for a mixed economy of images of aging that reflects the cultural reality of the societies in which we live. So, you know, the images that come from Manchester will not be suitable in the Midwest of the United States. But the alternative is the expectation doesn't seem to work the other way. So sometimes we get really awful images of boomers and silver surfers and all of these other terrible labels that are used in, you know, I'm sure it's not just my sort of Twitter feed that is full of these terrible things. I'm sure everybody sees these all the time.
Or the fact that you've got to be relentlessly smiling in order to demonstrate that you're aging successfully. I mean, for me, it's an engagement. So somebody sort of, I don't know, who's engaged in whatever it is they're doing, they might not be relentlessly, cheesily smiling. That's something important to sort of draw on.
I was going to say I mean, like Tom, the algorithms have reached me, so I've got silver foxes liberating money out of their pensions in my Twitter feed and Facebook all the time, and it's really annoying. And they are all wearing linen, so it's really quite cliched. But I think it's a really interesting space, because I was talking through this with my wife, and we talked about the inevitably Jane Fonda. So you get to this sort of, the only older people that can be featured are the people who've somehow retained some impossible youth. And that's another cliche that I think is really dangerous. There are some advertisers and some big brands that have started to try and counter this. I'm thinking of Procter & Gamble, for example, have had a few campaigns where they start to look at proper diversity in their visual mix. It's not perfect, but it's the starting point of a shift, certainly in marketing and advertising, where with Dove, for example, you know, they're at least trying. I'm not saying it's perfect, you can shoot me down, but they're at least trying to get us to a different space. And the final thing I'd say is Tom's Google algorithms and what comes up at the top of an image search and what's most popular in Image Bank can be changed. Not just by hacking it, we could all have fun trying to do that, but actually you can work with some of these Image Banks to change the algorithms. And that is a proactive project that somebody could take on to actually shift this relatively quickly. And there's some people on the call today who know how Image Banks work, and they'd probably be able to bring.
Okay, and we're starting to get some more really interesting questions in, but we're kind of at a time for a comfort break now. So what I would say is that we'll have a look at those over the break, and we'll try and feed some of those questions into the discussion after the break. So we're going to take 10 minutes. So if we reconvene at just past 5 past, that's 6 minutes past, 7 minutes past, sort of just after 5 past. So just give yourselves time to grab yourself a coffee, go to the loo, whatever you need to do, have a bit of fresh air, and we'll see you in about 10 minutes time. Thank you so much. Thank you especially to Alex, Tom and Steve for your really thought-provoking and thoughtful interventions. So see you in a few minutes. Hello, Antonia.
Hello.
Can everyone else hear us?
Yes.
I was expecting any mean things. Seems to be going rather well.
Yes, a very interesting conversation so far. So yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things that I'm really enjoying is the fact that people are saying we could do this, we could do that, like actual actions. Good. I need to go and have my comfort break, so I'll be back. Liz, are you still there? I think she's actually.
I'm still here.
Ah, okay, hello.
Hi.
Hi. I've been cutting and pasting questions, and as there aren't so many of them, it's not so hard. But thanks for highlighting that one, that Andy Barry's one. But I'll just go through in a sec. I'll come back in a second. I'll just go through ones that we haven't asked and see. There's one or two that I'm struggling to condense down, but yeah, I think we're all right, aren't we? We seem to be.
Liz, can I ask you something? Can you hear me?
Hi, Ros. Yes, I can hear you.
No, I'm talking to the wrong person. It's just sorry, Liz. It's Julia, who's our chair lady. Is that right, Julia? She's muted now.
Yes.
Julia,
Hello.
can you hear me?
I can.
I am very deaf, and I have great difficulty in hearing the questions people have asked. So I wouldn't dare put in my 2 pence because I'll probably get the end of the stick. Could you just voice those questions just a little bit slower? I don't mean as a snail's pace, but just a little bit slower.
Of course I can. Sorry, I do talk really quickly.
Right, I'll mute myself again and go and have my comfort break.
Okay, I will talk slower. Thank you. Hello, everybody. I think people are back now, or yeah, most people seem to be back. We are now in the second part of our event, and we are going to hear now from Pauline Smith, Sabrina Fuller and Heather Bell. They're going to talk for about 5 minutes each to tell you a bit about who they are and where their perspective comes from, and to give some thoughts and ideas around the subject of older people, the representation of older people in the media. Then we'll have time for a facilitated discussion and some more questions, so which we are picking up from the chat. So if you have questions, please jot them down in the chat, and then we will try and make sure they are asked at some point. So I'm going to start, kick off now by introducing Pauline. So Pauline Smith is a mature Mancunian who's lived and worked for over 30 years in Belgium, Germany and the Netherlands until returning to Manchester in 2008. So she has continued since 2010 consulting in business, and is involved in Pride and Ageing programme at the LGBT Foundation, of which she is a trustee. She's a community reporter for My Generation, and a member of the LGBT social group for older people in Manchester, out in the city, and is an active member of the Greater Manchester Older People's Network, whose original idea the Old Frame New Picture photography competition was. So Pauline, over to you if you're here.
Thank you. Yes, good morning everybody. Thank you for the introduction, Julie. I think really it's just to talk about the huge percentage of the population that older people actually represent. You know, the population of Greater Manchester is 2.8 million, and there's nearly 1 million people over 50, which is the definition of older people if you're over 50. However, I think in reality, we're in like three groups of older people. So there's like 50 to 70, these are rough cuts, where a lot of people are still economically active and working. And then there's sort of 70 to sometime after that, which is dependent on your health and all kinds of other things, where you can do all kinds of volunteer work and everything else. And then after that, it's, you know, it's the wooden box and or the care home. However, what I think is important is, and I got involved in the competition through Greater Manchester Old People's Network. I was involved in the committee that came up with the ideas and the categories and everything else. And we were a very diverse group of different ethnicities and genders and everything else. And we should have launched it earlier, but COVID delayed that twice. So we're now at the starting gate. And I personally am appalled by the images of older people that are generally put out there. And hopefully this competition and the discussions we've already had and we will have later will enable us to come up with some much more positive images of us as a group of people, because everybody gets old. Everybody's got a gran and a granddad and an aunt and an uncle, and one day they will be old as well. You know, I wrote a round letter to the trustees at the foundation saying, hey, one day you'll all be as old as me. You know, right now there's the next oldest trustee is 20 years younger than me. So I think, you know, on that positive note, I'll hand back to Julie.
Thank you very much, Pauline. Obviously, we're going to have more of a chance to hear from Pauline in a minute. So now I would like to introduce Sabrina. So Sabrina Fuller is an artist who explores difference and how exclusion leads to acts of creative resistance. So she's combined a career in the NHS with photography, and has exhibited nationally and internationally. before retiring and studying an MA in photography at the London College of Communication. She is one of our 2020 Older artists. So that was a scheme set up, as Sabrina mentioned earlier, in her to support older artists across Greater Manchester. We've managed to fund Castlefield Gallery to support 10 artists all over 50 who are professional standard artists who want to develop their practice. And Sabrina is an active member of numerous collaborative and collective groups and networks. So that'll be really interesting to hear from an older creative professional's perspective. So Sabrina.
Hi. Just let me share my screen. Right. Yeah, I think that what I really want to talk about in this, in relation to what's been said already, is intergenerationality and the importance of older people being seen in terms of their contribution rather than as a category. As been said, I worked in the NHS. I was in my 40s by the time I took up photography, and I was lucky enough to fall in with Red Eye, the photography network, at an early stage in its inception. So though I was very inexperienced, I made myself useful and learnt massively, and built some really important relationships and networks that have really seen me through my career. I've been involved in numerous group shows and solo shows, a couple of solo shows in Barcelona, one at the People's History Museum. And then when I retired at 60, which was 5 years ago, I went on to do my MA in photography. Now I work mainly with moving image, sound and text. Now, when we'd finished our MA, 4 of us, and 2 of them were in their 20s, were lucky enough to be granted the ArtQuest funded Lifeboat Group residency, which is a year's professional development. I was the lead artist in that group. And that was terrific in terms of the support we got to really sort of launch ourselves into the world as artists. And I think what I'm going to talk about is the importance of networks and groups. And for me, some of those have been feminist, but very many of them have been intergenerational, as well as some groups like Boulder and other groups I'm part of that are largely of older artists, in actually forming a basis for really being able to sort of project a good image of older people as sort of integral to what's going on rather than a special group. So I'm interested in difference, and I'm interested in how, if you're seen as different and you're excluded, you actually develop new ways of being and new ways of communicating that are actually a sort of resistance to the status quo. My feminism has been really important in terms of that, because of the principles of collaboration, participation, giving voice, which are a really important part of my practice. When I finished my MA, I sort of became increasingly annoyed about the way older people are portrayed in the media. And I started making work about how, as an older person, you're actually everyone you ever have been. And this thing about layered subjectivities. And I was going to play a bit of this, but I'm not now. This was a video I made that involved the voices of 9 older women. And by older women, I specifically mean women over 60. And their voices are layered. I use the tidal river as a metaphor, because when you watch the tidal Thames, you can't, depending on whether the tide's going in or out, the current's going in a different direction. And I'm really interested in that idea about time as mutable. And this is what the voices talk about: time as mutable, how you change as you grow older, but you also stay the same, how you become more experienced, but you're in a constant state of discovery. And you're not, to quote one of my contributors, an expletive, wise old crone. The importance of the context of when we grew up and what we've got to offer because of that post-war perspective that we can throw about how we grew up believing the world would always be a better place for everyone. And I think that's really important to maintain that perspective. So becoming older as cyclical, as layered, as non-linear, and that thing about being everyone you've ever been.
All of, you know.
Oh, sorry. The end of last year, I was lucky enough to get selected for the Boulder group. There's 10 of us. We're from across Greater Manchester. When they talk about older, we're what, 50 upwards. As I said, I'm 65. It's funded by GMCA. It's been an absolutely fabulous program of professional development, and we've had mentoring. We've also self-organized. We do crit sessions, and we had an Instagram show last over the summer where, and these are some of the images from it. I mean, we've got 400 followers on Instagram. Some of the professional development has been about using the media, and I think that's really important, and about using social media. We're coming up for a show with the younger artists as well in November at Castlefield, which is an amazing opportunity for us. But the whole program has been absolutely fantastic. We'd all say that in terms of helping us really grab opportunities and take risks with our practice, and sort of continually really improving our practice. So I think in summing up, what I want to say is the importance of being part of intergenerational as well as groups of older people, and really starting to be seen as for what we contribute rather than being older. This was the peer mentoring group from the ArtQuest funded group, and it was a real mixture of ages. And I think that when you have that thing about shared ventures and common goals, that people start to forget about how old you are and think about what you can contribute. What's really, really benefited me has been support from Red Eye onwards for development at all levels, and I still see a need for that, and that should really include how you deal with the media, how you deal with social media, and really raising our profile, and a real emphasis on developing IT skills and support for people as they grow older, because especially in a time of COVID, that's really important in making sure that older people can participate fully.
Thank you very much, Sabrina. So obviously it'd be good to hear your opinions on some of the questions we'll be talking about in a minute. I want to quickly move on to our final contributor today, Heather Bell. Heather is another artist. She's an emerging photographer who graduated in 2019 from the University of Salford. And her work investigates loss and disappearance. And we wanted to hear from a younger artist, someone who's collaborating with older artists. So Heather, I'd be really interested to hear your perspective now.
Yeah, so I'll quickly give you a little bit about me. When I was 12, my dad became quite heavily disabled out of the blue, and that kind of got me into figuring out why he was treated so differently as sort of an elderly disabled man. People would not talk to him as a human anymore, and it really quite broadened my mind as a young kid into kind of investigating all the other kind of isms, from sexism to ageist and all sorts. And then my photography career kind of started off when I was so young, and it was only really when I was doing my dissertation is when I actually kind of fully understood what ageism meant. So is it not let me skip? So let me move this. So during my degree, I volunteered quite a lot for many different, youth groups. I was part of the Young Carer group myself, and one big one for me, as I never really had any grandparents, was volunteering at elderly homes. And don't get me wrong, when I was young, I look back and I'm like, I was very ageist, and I went there with this idea of, oh, I want to help, when they didn't need help in the slightest. So I actually got really close to a lot of the people I worked with, and I did consider them family. And over time, they would give me their archives and was like, do you want to see snippets of my life? And the stories to tell was just beautiful. And then I eventually started to work with them and their families, especially after due to COVID. A lot of them have sadly passed. So right now I'm working with their families to kind of tell their stories. So as a photographer, I saw on social media a lot, especially with COVID, that this really frustrated me. People were taking snapshots of elderly people on their own, whether it was in empty supermarkets or on the streets, yet with no links anywhere of supporting or any awareness posts. It was just a snapshot that looked very sad. And it was, for me, it's always, you do need to make people aware of what's happening and of the issues, but at the same time, show where to go from there. You shouldn't just be exploiting their sadness for that snapshot for all the shares on social media without actually going forward with anything. So I've been a social media manager for many years now, and I know exactly how to play the algorithms. So I kind of used that to my advantage when COVID happened and started to create work from the archives to explore loss and how to deal with loss and what loss actually means. And for me, dealing with loss at a very young age, it was always about, my mum always said, you remember people for their happy memories. So you never remember for actually the loss. So I kind of went on to this whole project of exploring their archives and focusing on what people love the most, as why would you remember people for what society tells us is their end of the life rather than the life they really led. So that was what I've kind of been doing so far through COVID until I got the Obstructions opportunity. So now I'm working a lot more closer with the communities that I've worked with previously. This is one of my projects from Doorways, and this is the COVID project that I'm reproducing right now as part of the exhibition. It was to do with bulk buying PPE with improper use, leaving, and it wasn't, this is the bit that I always really annoyed me. It wasn't just the elderly, so I don't know why it was, oh, the elderly need help, they are vulnerable. It's not. It was about people who can't afford that £6.50 roll of toilet paper. It was people that can't afford to get Amazon Prime, to get gear to protect themselves. And it was that really infuriated me, that people were saying this with, and don't get me wrong, there is people that need help, but in all age groups, in all of them. I needed help from the very start, and I'm only 22. So that was like completely irrelevant. So I did start this in the hope of you bulk buying the PPE, leaving people out and not actually using it. So the social media actually told us that if we don't get toilet roll, we're going to get COVID. Just blew my mind. So that's kind of the whole idea of this COVID project. Was I wanted to highlight the issues because I don't personally feel we should be ignoring these issues, but I think we should definitely be doing it in another way and making people not only aware, but aware of where to go to if they want to help. Because what does annoy me with artists is when they kind of put it everywhere and say, yeah, this is an issue. Like, we know it's an issue, but where do we go to help now? So that's what I'm doing kind of right now. Sorry if I've gone over, I forgot to set my timer.
Don't worry. Thank you ever so much. Right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a few questions out to our three contributors now. They're questions that have come through in the chat and a couple of things that we'd already flagged up before. So the first thing I want, and the three of you just feel free to chip in as you want to. So I'm going to try and fuse a couple of things together. So how important do you think that it is that older people lead on this issue? And should this be something that's led by older people, or is this something that should be how can it be intergenerational? And is anyone actually going to listen?
If I might, if you don't mind me saying something dead quickly on this, on social media, I can't remember the lady's name, but this lady who, I think she is 96 years old, and she has created this account which has millions of followers, where she puts sparkles all over her house, and she doesn't care to show who she is. Like, she is her, and that is amazing. And I think people showing who they are as individuals are definitely going to get more recognition, because right now, non-artists, no one's really putting anything out about themselves, so it's quite hard to kind of contradict what's going on in society and on social media right now, when there's nothing really already out there. So I definitely think people would listen, because they listened to that one lady who started up an Instagram account, and now she's gone absolutely viral.
Okay, Pauline or Sabrina, have either of you got anything you want to contribute to this question? Like, whose job is it to do this?
Well, it's not any one person. It's not any one group's. It's like with Black Lives Matter. It's everyone's responsibility. But at the same time, it's really important that older people are not necessarily leading, but that we make our voices heard. And I mean, there is this real blanket approach to older people. And as Steve said, you know, most of the people under 70 out there were, you know, 5 years ago were running Greater Manchester the councils of Greater Manchester. You know, we really need to encourage older people to get their voices out there. We really need media training and so on, because otherwise you end up with sort of really quite a patronizing approach to who older people are, instead of that that really diverse sort of view of, you know, what older people are. You're talking, as again Steve said, you know, from people from 50 to people who are 100. So we need to make our voices heard.
Couple of comments. In the LGBT community, older people often live alone, which is not peculiar to the LGBT community, but they're often estranged from their family in the generation that I'm in. And there are helplines that are provided in the same way that Age UK provides a whole series of helplines. Because one of the downsides of COVID for anyone who's older is that all the social groups we used to go to no longer meet. So to give you a concrete example, since the 12th of March, when I personally went into my own lockdown, I have physically met, other than taxi drivers and people selling me food, 4 people in over nearly 7 months. And the intergenerational thing is really important, because I'm supported over the phone by a lot of younger people, including my son, who's only 30. But I have other people who call me. And I think what we have to do is to end up that older people are respected. Part of the issue with COVID is that we've been demonized. And some of the national media have, you know, basically said, well, all these people are dying in care homes, tough, you know, let's cull the oldies. So I think we stand at a crossroads as a society as to how we handle aging.
Thank you. Another question that I've synthesized in a couple of questions here. In our bid and enthusiasm to combat ageism in the media, we often at risk of taking a different, but nonetheless erroneous kind of approach of one size fits all and ignoring diversity. So how do you think, what can we do to avoid that pitfall? of basically ignoring, representing the positive sides of aging, and ignoring diversity as part of that?
I personally don't think we should ignore it at the same time. So it's kind of a difficult one. I'll let someone else
do it. I mean, what are the issues around, anybody wants to chip in, what are the issues around diversity here that we're at risk of falling into some really dangerous traps?
I think there are several issues, and it's interesting that in the photography competition, 2 of the judges are from the Greater Manchester Old People's Network, and there was a lot of debate earlier on during the process of who should be on the judging committee, and well, let's have all kinds of experts. And we had a discussion and said, no, we have to have 2 people who are just ordinary people. We've ended up with an ethnic balance. You know, 1 person is non-white and 1 person is white out of the 2 judges from the Greater Manchester Older People's Network. And the whole committee had a wide range of ethnicities and backgrounds. And we reflect what the reality is in Greater Manchester. You know, it's not a white-only community. So the other thing is that there are a lot of stories that older people have, and Age UK and Oldham have put together a program where they make a book for older people, which is about their lives, and they're doing about 150 of these a year. I mean, it's an amazing project which is available in the public record, and the LGBT Foundation is interviewing older LGBT people to go into the archives at Manchester Central Library, and I'm one of the people who was interviewed for that. And I think we're up to double figures now, because it's important for younger people to recognise that we lived and grew up in a different world,
100%.
but we're still articulate and contributing.
I think there's definitely like an issue in my generation, and before I kind of took the time to really research it, I had no clue on the severity of how the media portrayed the elderly generation. It was absolutely shocking, and it's kind of, the target needs to be to bring more awareness to the younger people, because essentially they will get old one day, and they need to set the way that they want to be treated. And I think that's where the main issue lies. Is I've always said we need to influence whoever's next, because they're the ones that are going to make the change. People can be stuck in the ways where they just categorically refuse to try and change.
But it's really, really important, and you know, to agree with Pauline about getting older people, and that's, you know, when you're talking about people from 50 upwards, getting people's voices heard. And I think GMCA are doing a fabulous job in terms of the support they give to different networks. I think the thing about media training and social media training is really important, so that if you really, really empower the groups and networks that are out there and really help people get involved in those groups and networks and give them those development opportunities, then you start to get the diversity of voices being heard.
Thank you ever so much, Sabrina. I'm hearing quite a lot here about intergenerational divides in the chat, about generations being pitched against each other. I mean, that's blatantly clear, isn't it? Where we have, you know, we had the horrible polemic around, horrible narratives around older people at the beginning of lockdown, basically just leaving people to get on with it in care homes. And then we've got the opposite, which is equally damaging in a very different way, where we're basically blaming young people for not socially distancing. and basically making a kind of second wave their fault. And neither of those are, none of it's simple, and they're both really harmful. So this idea that we're pitching generations against each other is really, really damaging. I'd like to broaden out the discussion for the last part of our session to include Alex, Tom and Steve, if that's okay. So for the 6 of you, I've got there's a couple of questions I've got in the chat. So I'll just start with one here. Right, here's a question from Estelle. So it's a question about the risk of focusing on people's contributions. So in our contributions to society, in our attempt to push for a new non-ageist narrative, if it's important to focus on people's contribution, it's also critical to ensure we recognise and call for respect of people's dignity and rights, even if they are unable to contribute. So how do we go around this risk? How do we address this? So we're saying we're focusing on older people as people who contribute to society, but what about those people who cannot, and how do we protect their dignity and rights?
Can I just start off with that, because I think it related to what I was saying about contribution. I didn't mean only that we have to contribute to be recognised. And I think that thing, and that comes back to what Heather was talking about, you recognise everyone's dignity and rights, whether they're able to contribute. And it's not just older people who can't contribute. And also you have to look at what you mean by contributing, because it isn't just running groups and, you know, being a retired captain of industry. There are very, very many ways that people contribute to this society. So A, we recognise that wider sense of contributions, but B, we recognise everyone's right to dignity and respect.
Following on from Sabrina then, I don't know how everyone else feels, but do you not see as it's kind of like constantly grouping them together as this community where, in fact, from what I kind of look at, they are individuals, and it's just like in my generation, everyone is individuals, and it's kind of like we constantly pushing the elderly people into this group of the elderly generation. And I know it's generational differences, but I think that's where one of the big problems lies, if it's constantly referred as that generation and not the individuals and the stories, whereas I think it's the most fascinating generation out of all of them.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else want to chip in here? Tom, Alex, Steve?
I could come in, and I just think, you know, I'm a social gerontologist. I'm bound to say that studying social gerontology is really a fascinating topic, but it, you know, this type of conversation does demonstrate the need for, you know, a more gerontological understanding of society, whether that's at the sort of individual level, but also at the societal level. So it can talk about, for example, about intergenerational relations at the individual and family level in terms of how we get on or don't get on with, you know, children, grandchildren, aging parents, aging grandparents, but we also need to conceive of that at the societal level in terms of the intergenerational contract and the way in which we organize our society and meet the different needs of groups across society. So there's a balance to be struck there. And I really like, you know, what Sabrina had to say about understanding contributions then, because you can understand contributions in so many different ways at the individual, but also at the societal level. And there is no such thing as somebody who's not contributing in some way to society in a really important way. You know, however, you know, dependent somebody is, or however poor their health is and how intense their care needs are, they are still making an incredible contribution to society just by being there and being loved by family members. And, you know, there are all sorts of past contributions you can bring in as well as future contributions. So it's, the problem is the framing of old age, isn't it? That is represented here through media framing as a time that we need to tackle that fundamental focus on aging as decline, which I've been doing work on gerontology now for 30 years. When I started, colleagues in Germany were publishing books on aging as decline and needing to challenge that. This is deep-seated and requires a societal, cultural change, really.
Okay. Steve, you wanted to come in here.
Yeah, I was just going to back up the fact that this might be a multifaceted response that's needed, really. As a recent arrival in the older age group, tipping over 50, and rather shocked when the woman, Virginia Tandy, who I love very much, came to us for her brand for the Creative Aging Development Agency and said, we didn't want anybody young to do it. So I thought, well, there we are. We're in that age group. But I've been thinking about it a lot, and I think it is multifaceted. I think there's the point around contribution, and that's really fascinating. That's a rich story to tell. I think there is a point about diversity and just making sure people are aware of that when they're putting together media reports or campaigns. And there's probably a very basic set of do's and don'ts that Tom started to explore visually in what he was showing us. And I think these are different strands of work that, for me as a practitioner in the media and marketing and advertising, I could get my head around sort of, the sort of tick list of things not to do or to do, plus richer stories, and trying to bring a greater level of diversity into the visual mix of what we do. So I think it might be a multifaceted response that's needed. Okay,
thank you. There's a question that's kind of related to that. So somebody in the chat, sorry, I cut off your name, sorry, my cutting and pasting, that we need to be subversive to make change happen. Do we need some direct action? And I'm going to link that with another question about the commercial sector's role here. So what is it that, we've heard some great suggestions of things we're doing, some great initiatives that people are already undertaking. But what is it that we need to do? Do we need to take direct action? And then how do we link with the commercial sector's role here? What can we do to help them change the way they work so that we can mainstream this conversation?
No, just step into the void there, Julie, just because I came to, through my Twitter account, through COVID, I wouldn't have been calling out the BBC or the Guardian or the ITV about their awful use of images, but I think there is a need for some sort of campaign that just constantly draws attention to the unacceptable nature of the imagery that is used and the ways in which older people are represented. Steve was talking about the language of that is used in reporting and in advertising, and one of my own pet hates is the way in which newspapers refer to grandparents where there's no relevance at all of being a grandparent in the story. Grandfather trips over on the pavement. It's like, it's not really important whether they're grandparents or not. This is so, and there's a limit to what somebody, what I feel I can do, and I sometimes despair and think, well, let's call it a day, I've made my point. But if these were older people's voices systematically challenging the use of images, I think that would be just so much more powerful than a lone academic sat in his away from his office desk, working from home, firing off another message saying, hang on a bit, we've seen this wrinkly hand far too often already.
Yeah.
I just think something that is, a radical campaign from an age sector organization that takes this on as an engaging project that, satirizes the use of media or does something, but, that is, just emphasizes and constantly re-emphasizes the need that I see so many of these images, and I don't have the time to constantly call them out, but someone can do that.
It's one of them things, isn't it? Like if we see it with women, or if we see it with disabled people, and you see that kind of imagery, you're instantly like, actually, no, that's wrong. Actually, that's discrimination. So I think it should be the same kind of major kickback for ageism?
Age discrimination is actually illegal, and we should.
Exactly.
I was involved in a seminar run by Sheffield University where we actually had a lecture which was absolutely brilliant on what's legal and what's not legal, and that is really important. And I think that's something we should really be pursuing, is taking things to task. And just to say, if you are like me at 65, I received targeted advertising. When they're targeting you because they think you've got a few quid, because a lot of our generation have, suddenly the images become very, very, very positive. You should see what I get on my Lloyds Bank website. Okay.
That's, can I say something? Can I come in?
Yeah, please.
Thank you. Yeah, that's so true, Sabrina. I was just thinking, Tom, that you're not really a lone voice any longer, though. I mean, call me Pollyanna, but there, you know, I've felt that over the last few years since I've been involved in this, that more and more people are coming on board, and you know, I feel I'm just one voice doing one small thing in my particular little niche interest, but that there's almost an army of us who are coming forwards. And that, you know, this webinar is a case in point. You know, there is growing interest, and there's a growing number of people who are saying, no, you know, we don't accept the ghastly sort of birthday cards, the ageist birthday cards, the this and the that. And I guess it takes a while, but you know, I feel like on social media, a lot of us are joining up with sort of other lone voices, if you like, sort of across the pond, in Australia, wherever. Yeah, call me Pollyanna. I feel that maybe we are shouting, you know, we are pitching in, we are jumping in there in our own individual ways. I think, I hope, maybe.
I think you're right, Alex. I use an example. I'm a community reporter for Greater Manchester for talking about my generation, and the message we put out is that older people can do all kinds of things. I mean, one example that springs to mind, we found a guy in his 80s who was walking on, he couldn't walk, he was on sticks. And then he took up hand boxing, and now, and he's about 85, 86, and now he can walk normally and do all kinds of other things. And there's a whole diverse range of articles and nostalgia and poetry. And, you know, on a personal level, I discovered during COVID the gift I had as a teenager to write poetry. And it's all the little steps that older people make together. It's not necessarily that we all have to be joined up, but that we're aware that other older people, excuse me, have a whole range of skills which they're contributing to in different ways, like the King Lear prizes during the summer, which was only for over 70s and had all kinds of different categories. And thousands of people across the UK contributed to that, just to show, and some of the examples of what they've written and photographed and painted are just amazing.
Mm.
Old trick, I'm on mute. Thank you very much, Pauline. Can I ask Steve, can I ask you, how do we encourage brands to incorporate more older people in their marketing? Are we on a hiding to nothing there? How do we work with the commercial sector? How do we work with advertisers?
Well, I think actually it's a really focused piece of activity. I saw that in the chat. I think it's a really good question. It'd be such a really good focused piece of activity that could be done. And it has been done in other areas of advertising where people have sought to increase the level of corporate responsibility. It's a horrible phrase. A friend of mine calls it the icing on the shit, but people have to use it. So corporate responsibility is a thing. And I think you could actually, sorry, I've just realized my kids are in the room. Swearing dad is not good. Sorry guys. But I think as a focused piece of activity, you could absolutely tackle this with brands. And there are some leadership leaders already in this space that I mentioned earlier in my talk. So I think, and through the sort of main sort of campaign, the drum, there are the right sort of platforms you could work with to actually start changing practice there. So I think it would be a great piece of work to be done. And I think using people like Procter & Gamble, probably some of the big heavy hitters in this space, would be a great starting point. And also finding, and it's been referenced before, Sabrina mentioned the people who used to run the City of Manchester, but now there are some incredibly brilliant people in the world of marketing and advertising who I'm sure would be a powerful voice in this space, who can speak for themselves as older people. So I think bringing them into the mix would be really powerful as well. So I think it'd be a great campaign to run, and I'd be happy to put some thought into it.
Okay, that's brilliant. Is anyone else, any final thoughts before I sum up? Okay, I'll sum up then. I want to end on, I'm always really nervous about events like this where we all talk and we all agree and it's fantastic and we all go away and then nothing happens. So I don't want that to happen. So what I'm hearing is we need a radical campaign. We need to call people out. So these are things we can do. A radical campaign is something maybe we need a coalition of the willing. So that's organisations and maybe individuals as well. But also as individuals, we can carry on calling people out, particularly if we're on social media. We need to systematically call out the use of really negative images. And we don't always have to do that in an aggressive way. We can do that, we can satirise that, but we also need to mount some kind of serious campaign. We can use the law when it is on our side, and we need to raise awareness of what is discrimination and where ageism comes into this. We can do some focused work with advertisers. I think the time is probably right for that. Drawing on people's corporate social responsibility policies and awareness, and there are certain brands like Procter & Gamble who we might be able to work with as sort of early adopters. And finally, we need to keep positivity. All is not lost. We can be a bit Pollyanna about this as well. Things have changed, things are changing. Events like this do contribute to a sea change. We have a lot of different competitions and initiatives running around the country. We have a lot of age-friendly initiatives led by older people who really want to change the way that older people are represented in the media and in society. So I think I'd like to thank you all really much for coming. There's been some great chat that we've tried to capture. We've recorded this session. Some people have asked for a copy of the slides, so we'll be asking our presenters afterwards if they don't mind for those to be shared, and then we will send that out to everyone who's taken part. There's been some chat with the Centre for Ageing Better, and Steve has just offered to get involved. So Tom, I know you're already really active involved, so I think if you maybe work for an organisation or you're part of a group and you really want us to take some of these ideas forward, I'm happy to undertake to do that as part of my role. I'm only around till next May in my job, but I work very closely with the Greater Manchester Ageing Hub, and I know that the Ageing Hub is really keen on this area of work. So this conversation doesn't stop here. Basically, I'd just leaves me to say thank you very much. Watch this space, we will be in contact. And if you'd like more information about the photography competition, thank you, Antonia, you've just put up the slide. The deadline for entries is Friday the 13th of November. We will be running a campaign after Christmas on digital billboards outside of a major supermarket chain across Greater Manchester of the winning images. The images will be made into postcards and then be made available to people for non-commercial purposes. So maybe that's something we can hang some future activity on. It's something we can use to show an alternative way of representing older people. Finally, I'd just like to ask you, before you leave the event today, maybe to just note down something in the chat, one thing. We're not going to ask you to fill in a form. Just note down maybe one thing in the chat that you're taking away from this